May 13, 1942, 5:59 p.m., South China Sea. Inside the American submarine USS Skipjack, Lieutenant Commander James Coe had the kind of attack submariners wait weeks to get. The target was only 800 yards away. The firing solution was clean. The angle was favorable. The torpedoes were already on their way. Everyone aboard expected the same ending: a wake under the enemy ship, a violent explosion, then steel folding into the sea. That expectation was reasonable. The U.S. Navy had entered the war with the Mark 14, its standard submarine torpedo. On paper, it looked advanced. It could run 9,000 yards at 31.5 knots or 4,500 yards at 46 knots. It carried a 507-pound TNT warhead, and with its secret magnetic exploder, it was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, where the hull was weakest. But what they didn't know was that the weapon itself had become the hidden failure inside America's submarine war. Coe watched one torpedo pass under the target's stern. No hit, no explosion, no kill. And across the Pacific, other American submarine captains were reporting the same thing: good approach, good shot, wrong result. Some torpedoes ran too deep, some exploded too early, some hit and failed to detonate at all. The paradox was brutal. America had invested in a modern undersea weapon, yet for about 21 months after the start of the war, the Mark 14 and its Mark 6 exploder suffered 3 major defects that turned successful attacks into wasted opportunities. That was the impossible challenge. How do you fight an industrial war across the Pacific when your most important submarine weapon is missing by about 10 feet? How do you prove the defect when the torpedo vanishes underwater? The test establishment says the design is sound, and each failure can hide the next one. This is the story of how American submariners exposed one of the most damaging engineering failures in naval history. How they proved the Navy's standard torpedo was running too deep, firing too early, and failing on impact. And how a few officers forced the system to confront a weapon that was crippling America's early submarine campaign from the inside.
To understand why this mattered so much, you need to understand the role submarines were supposed to play in the Pacific War. The United States could not strike every Japanese supply route quickly with carriers alone. The Pacific was too large, the distances too extreme, and the early war balance too unstable. But submarines had one enormous advantage: they could disappear into the sea lanes Japan depended on. Oil tankers, cargo ships, troop transports, factory ships, freighters moving food, metals, fuel, and ammunition. That was the real target set. By December 1941, the U.S. Navy had 78 Fleet-type submarines and 24 older S-type submarines. The fleet boats normally carried 24 torpedoes and had 8 21-inch torpedo tubes. Their main striking weapon was the Mark 14. If that torpedo worked properly, American submarines could attack the logistical bloodstream of the Japanese Empire long before other arms of the fleet could reach every route. Think of the submarine as a safecracker and the torpedo as the final turning of the dial. The submarine had to travel thousands of miles, avoid aircraft and escorts, locate the convoy, calculate speed and bearing, and move into firing position without being seen. That was all the hard work. The torpedo was the last decisive step. If it failed, the entire mission could collapse in the final second. And that is what began to happen. The Mark 14 was not a crude weapon. It was powered by an alcohol-fueled steam turbine. It used twin counter-rotating propellers. It had a secret detonating system called the Mark 6 exploder, designed to fire either by direct impact or by magnetic influence under a target's keel. That second feature was the real promise. Instead of slamming into the side armor, the torpedo could pass underneath and break a ship from below. In theory, that was smarter and more destructive than older designs. But theory was the problem. Before the war, the Mark 14 had not been tested in the fully realistic way a combat weapon needed to be tested. Practice configurations, exercise heads, shallow water methods, and incomplete proofing created confidence without certainty. The submarine force was then sent into war carrying a weapon that looked modern, sounded modern, and had been declared ready. What nobody realized at the time was that the Navy had built a torpedo system advanced enough to fail in multiple hidden ways at once. But here's the engineering challenge nobody had solved before. The Mark 14 did not have one fatal defect. It had three, and each one made the others harder to see. The first defect was depth control. This was the simplest failure to describe and one of the hardest to diagnose. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet should not run at 20 feet. That is not a minor drift. That is the difference between striking a target and sliding harmlessly underneath it. Imagine aiming a rifle perfectly at chest height, only to discover that the barrel itself is bent downward just enough that every shot passes below the target. Your aim can be correct. Your judgment can be correct. The weapon still fails because the machine is lying to the operator. That is what the Mark 14 was doing. A widely cited post-war explanation pointed to the placement of the hydrostatic depth control valve and the way testing had masked the resulting error. The torpedo's depth mechanism was reacting to water pressure differently than expected, and the testing system failed to expose the real running depth clearly. In combat, the result was devastating. War shots were often running about 10 feet deeper than set, sometimes more. But even that was only the first layer. The second defect was the magnetic exploder. This was the secret feature the Navy believed would give American submarines a major advantage. The Mark 6 was designed to detect changes in a ship's magnetic field as the torpedo passed beneath the hull. When it worked, the torpedo could explode below the keel and break the ship's structure from underneath. It was a brilliant concept. It was also unreliable in war. Magnetic conditions vary with geography. Sea conditions vary. Target angle varies. The exact under-keel geometry varies. The result was a mechanism that could detonate too early, fail to detonate, or behave inconsistently in real patrol conditions. A secret advantage had become a hidden risk. Then came the third defect, and this one was the cruelest.
The contact exploder, the backup system that should have saved the attack if the magnetic feature failed, had its own flaw. On a clean, square hit, the firing mechanism could deform or jam under the shock of impact. That meant the best possible shot could produce the worst possible outcome. A submarine commander wanted a near-ideal 90-degree hit because that maximized the chance of striking the ship cleanly. But the Mark 14's contact pistol was most likely to fail under exactly that kind of square impact. Now the trap becomes clear. If the torpedo ran too deep, it might miss completely. If it reached the right place, the magnetic feature might fire too early. If the magnetic feature was disabled or failed, the contact pistol could still refuse to detonate on a direct hit. This was not one bad component, it was a stacked engineering failure. And the failures masked each other. A premature explosion could distract attention from deep running. A deep-running torpedo could make the magnetic system seem to fail in confusing ways. A dud on contact could be mistaken for bad aim unless someone proved the torpedo had actually struck where intended. To the men firing them, the effect was maddening. They had been told the torpedoes worked. Their attack math said the torpedoes should work, but the ocean kept returning a different answer.
This seemed almost impossible to solve quickly because the weapon lived inside a protected system. It was expensive, secret, technically complex, and defended by the very establishment that had designed and approved it. Admitting the problem meant admitting that the Navy had gone to war with a standard torpedo that had not been proven hard enough under combat-like conditions. And here is where the story becomes truly remarkable. The people who finally exposed the defects were not the original designers. They were the submariners who had to fight with the thing.
The real breakthrough came when Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, Jr. decided that if reports from the fleet and assurances from the Bureau of Ordnance did not match, then reality itself had to be tested. Lockwood was not guessing. He was a career submariner, and he was receiving repeated complaints from officers who knew how to attack. These were not random misses at extreme range. Boats like Salmon and Skipjack were reporting failures under conditions that should have produced hits. So Lockwood took the risk that mattered most in this story. He chose evidence over institution. The day walkthrough. 4:30 a.m., planning the proof. In June 1942, near Albany, Australia, Lockwood's command set up a simple but decisive experiment. A large fishing net would be suspended in deep water. If a torpedo passed through it, the hole would reveal the actual running depth. That sounds basic. It was. And that was the genius. 6 a.m. Make the torpedo realistic. A torpedo from Skipjack's stock was prepared with an exercise head, but not just any exercise setup. The head was weighted with calcium chloride solution so that it matched the weight of a real warhead as closely as possible. That detail mattered enormously. If you test an airplane with an empty fuselage, you are not really testing the airplane that goes to war. The same logic applied here. A torpedo has to be tested in a condition that matches its real fighting weight. 8 a.m. Fire the first shot. On June 20, 1942, the torpedo was fired from 850 yards with a depth setting of 10 feet. Everyone now had a measurable answer coming. 8:01 a.m. The first shock. The torpedo tore through the net at about 25 feet, not 10, about 25. That meant the weapon had run roughly 15 feet deeper on that shot than its setting called for. The next day confirmed the pattern. 2 more torpedoes were fired. They cut the net 8 feet and 11 feet deeper than set. Other summaries of the test sequence gave an overall figure of about 10 to 11 feet deeper than set, with some runs between 11 and 15 feet below the selected depth. That was the first breakthrough. The fleet had been right. The torpedo was wrong. Lockwood reported the evidence. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted. But after repeated pressure and confirmatory testing, the Navy officially conceded on August 1, 1942, that the Mark 14 was running about 10 feet deeper than set. That should have solved the crisis. It did not. But this solved only half the problem. Even after submariners corrected for depth, attacks still failed. Torpedoes still exploded too early. Others still struck and did nothing. That meant at least one more hidden defect was still in play.
The magnetic feature was stripped away. By early 1943, reports of premature detonations had piled up. On April 27, 1943, Bu-Ord acknowledged that the Mark 6 was vulnerable to prematures, especially when set for 12 feet or less. At this point, the engineering logic became unavoidable. If a system is too unreliable to predict, you remove complexity before you remove trust in the operator. So on June 24, 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered the magnetic feature inactivated for Pacific forces under his command. That was a dramatic step. The Navy was disabling the Mark 14's most advanced secret feature in the middle of the war because the mechanism was no longer helping the mission. Now only contact shots remained. And that is when the final defect finally stood in full view. July 24, 1943, Tinosa exposes the contact pistol. Lieutenant Commander L.R. Dan Daspit aboard USS Tinosa attacked the Japanese tanker Tonan Maru No. 3, a vessel of about 19,262 tons, one of the largest tankers in the Japanese fleet. The attack began at about 1,000 yards. Torpedoes were fired, some hit, 2 exploded. The tanker stopped but remained afloat. Daspit then closed in and continued firing from point-blank conditions over the next several hours. Hit after hit produced little or no effect. Several torpedoes struck and failed to explode. By the end, Daspit had overwhelming practical evidence that even with the magnetic feature removed, the contact mechanism itself was still betraying the submarine force. August 31, 1943. Kaho'olawe proves it. Lockwood ordered another set of direct tests, this time against submerged cliffs off Kaho'olawe. The idea was simple and severe. If a torpedo could be made to strike rock and then recovered, its internals could finally be examined after a hard impact. That test revealed the hidden truth. The firing pin had been released, but it had not traveled far enough to strike the primer with enough force to trigger the warhead. To confirm the diagnosis, dummy warheads fitted with exploders were dropped from about 90 feet onto a steel plate. 7 out of 10 failed. The contact pistol was not rugged enough to survive the shock of a square hit. In engineering terms, the mechanism could not reliably tolerate the violent deceleration of the very event it was designed to exploit. The final fix. Once that was known, the solution moved fast. Modified firing pin mechanisms were produced aboard the submarine tender USS Holland. On September 30, 1943, USS Barb departed Pearl Harbor, carrying 20 torpedoes fitted with the modified firing pins. By mid-October, enough improved parts had been produced for Pearl-based boats heading back to sea. That was the final breakthrough. Not a theory, not a memo, not a promise, a working fleet fix.
Once the 3 major defects had been isolated, the deep running problem, the magnetic exploder problem, and the contact pistol problem, the effect on submarine operations was immediate. American submarine captains did not suddenly become better tacticians in late 1943. Many of them had already been solving the attack problem correctly. What changed was that their torpedoes were finally beginning to do what the crews had assumed they would do from the first day of the war. The Mark 14 now ran much closer to its intended depth. The magnetic feature was no longer causing premature detonations in Pacific commands under Nimitz, and the contact pistol had been strengthened so a square hit was more likely to produce the explosion it should have produced all along. This is the key point mainstream history often misses. The early submarine campaign was not only limited by enemy escorts, weather, target scarcity, or command inexperience, it was also limited by a standard torpedo that repeatedly failed at the last moment. That turned correct attack solutions into empty patrol summaries. For submarine crews, the change was psychological as much as technical. Confidence in the weapon mattered. When the torpedo finally became reliable, the submarine force could convert tactical skill into actual destruction. And that mattered at the strategic level. Japanese shipping was the skeleton of Japanese power in the Pacific. Fuel, food, men, metal, munitions, all of it moved by sea. Every reliable torpedo increased the pressure on that system. What the crews finally had by late 1943 was not a miracle weapon. It was something more important, a standard weapon that finally worked.
The long-term impact of the Mark 14 scandal is measured in both ships and lessons. By the end of the war, U.S. submarines had inflicted catastrophic damage on Japanese shipping.
That later success can make it easy to forget how much of the early war was shaped by this one engineering scandal. If the Mark 14 had worked as intended from the beginning, the pressure on Japanese logistics could have intensified much earlier. More tankers might have been lost in 1942. More transport routes might have been disrupted before Japan had time to adapt. More patrols might have returned with confirmed sinkings instead of frustration. That is why this story matters far beyond torpedoes. It is about what happens when advanced engineering is trusted before it is tested hard enough. The scandal also changed the Navy's understanding of weapons development. A design bureau cannot assume that controlled proving ground results equal combat truth. A weapon must be tested under realistic conditions, with real users, real shock loads, real launch conditions, and realistic configurations. Secrecy made the problem worse. The Mark 6 exploder had been hidden from much of the fleet for years. That meant submariners went to war with almost no service experience using one of the most critical pieces of the entire system. And then there is the nation versus nation lesson. In wartime engineering competition, the winner is not always the side with the most elegant idea. It is often the side that identifies failure faster, admits it faster, and fixes it faster. In this case, the United States eventually corrected the problem, but it lost precious time doing so. What if this had gone on even longer? If Lockwood had accepted the Bureau's explanations in 1942, if Nimitz had refused to disable the magnetic feature in 1943, if Daspit's attack had been dismissed as bad luck, then the Pacific submarine campaign might have remained crippled much deeper into the war. That would have meant more Japanese fuel reaching the fleet, more cargo reaching island garrisons, more American crews risking their lives for attacks ruined before the first torpedo hit. One engineering correction changed the tempo of undersea warfare.
The achievement can be summed up in one sentence. American submariners and fleet officers exposed and corrected 3 major defects in the Mark 14 torpedo system, turning a weapon that ran about 10 feet too deep into a reliable instrument of war after about 21 months of failure and resistance. That is the real legacy. The next time you watch footage of a submarine launch, a guided weapon strike, or any military system praised for precision, remember this story. Precision is not created by design alone. It is created by testing, evidence, and the courage to admit when the machine is wrong. The Mark 14 looked modern. It sounded modern. It was declared ready. But for the first part of America's Pacific submarine war, it was one of the most costly engineering failures in the U.S. Navy. And the final haunting question still remains. If Charles Lockwood had not trusted the reports coming back from his submariners, how many more perfect attack solutions would have disappeared under enemy ships without a single explosion? The philosophical lesson is simple. Reality is the final engineer. This channel explores the engineering secrets that changed history, the hidden failures, the classified fixes, and the impossible solutions that mainstream history leaves out. If that is your kind of story, subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments. Thanks for watching.